But I'm going to talk very briefly about the second generation SARS-CoV-2 variants. And this was a presentation I gave a couple of days ago, but I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights here and kind of talk about, why it's important that we track these and what are the kind of current challenges surrounding the identification of these second generation variants and where, this group might be able to be kind of a resource in that regard. But first, what are second generation variants? These are new lineages that are derived from previous variants without an intermediate. So in other words, some sort of evolutionary leap occurred where it isn't, a single mutation where you went from a parent lineage to a sublineage. And I have an example here. This is the downsampled next strain tree, where with BA.2.75, for example, you can see that this kind of estimated common ancestor here is about 10 or even more mutations away from the kind of next most recent lineage in the tree. So this isn't, a single mutation or even 2 or 3 mutations to get from BA2 to BA.2.75. There was an evolutionary leap here that occurred to get from one to the other. And this is just one example. There have been so many designated recently. BA.2.10.1 is another example. And on this tree are just the lineages with enough prevalence to make it into this downsampled tree. There are many more. I know BQ.1.1 is growing pretty rapidly in Europe. We have BA.2.3.20 in the United States. And again, that's just a handful of very many. But I found this old thread from Tom Peacock on Twitter asking, why should we care about second generation variants? He says, well, they're evolving from already existing successful variants, which already have nasty properties. And here he's defining nasty as antigenicity, transmissibility, and I'll add to this immune evasion. That's really what we've been seeing recently. And this might mean it's easier for them to get the right or wrong combination of mutations to confer some sort of advantage. Then he also uses this analogy I liked of climbing a fitness mountain, where each current variant of concern had to climb from the bottom, whereas a second generation variant can start halfway up and kind of capitalize on the gains of the parent lineage. And here's a diagram I found from Mark Johnson on Twitter. Mark Johnson is a professor at University of Missouri who does a lot of work with SARS-CoV-2 and wastewater. And this diagram it's a lot, but I do like it because it's a good example of where you can see the same mutations popping up over and over and over again. We have just had this massive kind of convergent evolution scenario happen recently, which makes these second generation variants that much more difficult to identify. So for example, here, he has a diagram of how you get from the parent lineage to all of these new sublineages. And one example here is R346T. And this is in this diagram at least 9 times, I counted the other day. So you can see it pop up here. You can see it with BM.2 as well, BM.4.1.1, and many other times kind of throughout this graphic, which just makes it more difficult to identify BM.4.1.1, for example, when this lineage defining mutation is also defining of all of these other sublineages. And to kind of add to this, we've had all of these second generation variants, and on top of that, many more new sublineages designated in recent weeks, but there hasn't been a new pangolin version release in more than a month. And how do we identify these second generation variants when they haven't been implemented into pangolin yet? And we can't easily identify those lineages amongst all of the data that exists. And here on the left, I took some screenshots from some of the experts on Twitter talking about these second generation variants and kind of novel sublineages that we've been seeing recently. And so, we've had public health labs that'll, see something like this. They see these pango lineage and Nextclade and kind of just experts in the field of SARS-CoV-2 tweeting about these lineages that aren't implemented into the pangolin tool, asking, do we have these in our data? If not, how do we identify them going forward if they aren't in pangolin? And, typically, I say there are kind of two options here. You can do a manual search for the parent lineage and defining mutations. And we use the Terra platform for this, but of course, that's just one of many platforms. And any workflow that incorporates both pangolin and Nextclade will have these same challenges. And then the second option is to upload these to the Nextclade web tool or the Usher web platform as well, because both of those tools are kind of maintained by people on the pangolin team. And so they can incorporate the kind of most up-to-date lineages, whereas, that's not fully publicly available within the, regular pangolin tool yet. And so, typically I suggest that labs actually do both of these things, do both the kind of manual search and to upload to other platforms. But with this kind of manual search here, you do have a couple challenges. The first is that it requires prior knowledge of the parent lineage and mutation combinations. And where to find those lineage defining mutations is really the biggest challenge here. And this is also where I think, this group could be, a really good resource for this. I used to recommend people look at this list that was maintained by the Pango network, where they just have kind of a straightforward list of the new lineage and then the mutation or group of mutations that differentiates it from the parent lineage. However, it looks like this isn't as up to date, or perhaps they're only including lineages in here now that are, within the pangolin tool. And so you can't use this to help identify these kind of emerging lineages here. What I've been using recently is this collection from Cove Spectrum that's maintained by the Lineage Watch team. And I have a screenshot of it below here. And so you can see, in this list, you have kind of these new emerging lineages. And then on the right-hand side, a list of some of the mutations that you can use to kind of query for these sequences. But as you can see, it's not in kind of a standard format. Sometimes, you have the kind of GISAID notation where you have a gene abbreviation and underscore. Other times it's in the Nextclade format where you have, S:, and then the spike mutation. But again, formatting not consistent here, which makes it kind of difficult if you just want to easily identify these. And then on top of that, if you have a lineage that has, 10 mutations, for example, differentiating it from its parents, I wouldn't suggest searching by every single one of these, because you also want to be able to capture genomes that might have an N at one of these sites, right? So if you're searching by, M135T and a genome has an N at this site, you aren't going to pick that up. And so I always recommend people search by the smallest, but most specific list that they can in order to capture all of the genomes of this particular lineage, but exclude those that don't belong to this lineage. And now I'm kind of having sensitivity versus specificity flashbacks from my intro to EPI courses back in the day. But again, the more unique the mutation, the easier it is to search for these. If there are lineage defining mutations outside of the receptor binding domain in spike, those are easier to search for, slightly more unique. But if you can find a mutation that's outside of spike altogether, that's even better. For example, down here, you have one within the E gene here. And here you have some within spike, but outside the receptor binding domain. And so you can kind of get an idea now of how this might be really tricky. If you're trying to teach this to, public health labs that don't have a bioinformatician on their team, right? They're microbiologists that have kind of been thrust into bioinformatics amidst the pandemic, right? And so that's kind of where I'll conclude here. I was also showing labs how to search, within, Nextclade versus GISAID, because the notation is different. But hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the challenges we've been kind of facing recently with teaching labs how to identify these, and the fact that there's not kind of a single best resource for where you'd go to find, the list of mutations to search by. And if anyone in this group has, specific ideas, I would love to hear them on how we could better communicate this to public health labs. And I was also thinking, perhaps we create a resource. It would be a bit of a challenge because we would also have to maintain it as, new lineages become available. And that might be why someone hasn't created that yet, right? Because that's kind of an undertaking, right? And it would really be kind of a group effort also. So if I were to kind of create this, I would also need kind of other people's assistance in kind of maintaining that. But yeah, thanks, Kevin, for the opportunity to kind of present and talk about this today. And I'd love to hear if anyone has kind of any feedback or ideas on how we could best go about this.